My name is Robert Sellers. I'm the Vice Provost for Equity and Inclusion and Chief Diversity Officer here at the University of Michigan. It is my great honor and pride to kick off this evening's event, which is also the official kickoff of our 2017 Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Summit. I want to thank you all for coming out today. We have a wonderful presentation ahead of us. This event is designed to celebrate our commitment to making the University of Michigan a more diverse, equitable, and inclusive community. Over the next week, there'll be a number of events illuminating much of the progress that has been made in the past year with regards to the DEI strategic plan. As Chief Diversity Officer, I have the great pleasure of getting a unique vantage point in which to see that progress. And I can tell you, I am deeply proud of the work that has been done by many of you out there in the audience, as well as the folks who are in my office in terms of the review of this first year in the planning process. In looking at the plans, it is clear that we are no longer in a place where the question is whether we should do something about diversity, equity, and inclusion. We are in a place now where the question is, what should we be doing with respect to diversity, equity, and inclusion? And that initial momentum is critical, because any physicist will tell you that inertia is a blank. And we are no longer standing still. We're moving forward, and we're moving forward even in the face of really, really troubling and disturbing times. We're moving forward in the face of a period of time in which there's probably greater divisiveness than many of us have seen. And this divisiveness clearly is much broader than our community and our campus, and often is originating from outside of our campus. But like everything, has an impact on our campus. So our challenge is to both understand, embrace, and address that day-to-day challenge in such a way that allows us as a community to be effective, to be supportive, to be productive, while at the same point in time that we as a larger community keep our eye on a much bigger prize. And that prize is long-term institutional change. And I can tell you, from my vantage point, I have seen some of that long-term institutional change. We still got a long, long, long way to go, but we are not at the very beginning. So I just want to share with you that message as we kick off our events this week. And someone who I think can help us as a community as we think about the challenge that we face ahead of us and the work that is yet to be done is our keynote speaker, Claude Steele. Yeah, woo! That's woo! Claude M. Steele is currently a professor of psychology at Stanford University. He holds a BA in psychology from Hiram College, as well as a PhD in social psychology and statistical psychology from Ohio State University, which we will not hold against him. He was also a member of the Department of Psychology here at the University of Michigan from 1987 to 1991. Even though he was only here for 4 years, his influence, his reach, his touch in this community has lasted long after and up until this day, as witnessed by many of the folks here in the audience. Over Claude's career, he served in several major academic leadership positions, including the executive chancellor and provost at UC Berkeley. Prior to that, he was the dean of the School of Education at Stanford University, as well as provost at Columbia University. Claude has received numerous honors and awards for his scholarship. He's been elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the National Academy of Sciences, the National Science Board, the National Academy of Education, and the American Philosophical Society. Claude is probably best known for his work on stereotype threat and its application to minority student academic performance. In 2010, he released his very, very influential book, Whistling Vivaldi and Other Clues to How Stereotypes Affect Us, summarizing years of research on stereotype threat and the underperformance of minority students in higher education. The title of his talk today is Stereotype Threat and Identity Threat, the Science of a Diverse Community. Please join me in welcoming to the stage Dr. Claude Steele.
Thank you. Thank you, Rob, for that wonderful introduction. It is a genuine pleasure to be here. When I come to Michigan, I always have a mix of almost all positive emotions. The first of which is I feel very much at home here. You know, I just feel that I owe so much to Michigan. In addition to feeling at home, I feel a sense of indebtedness to its intellectual community, to the university, to the spirit of the university, which I happen to be at a very formative time in my career. It set me on the path that, the research path that I've been following for the last 30 years, and that generated the research and the ideas that I'm going to talk about today for the most part. So I feel a huge sense of comfort and being at home and happiness to be here. Also, I have dear, dear friends in Michigan. Some of my dearest and some of my family's dearest friends are here in Ann Arbor and at the University of Michigan. So it's always a pleasure to come back and be in that feeling. Today, I would like to focus on a new way of organizing my thinking. I guess maybe I could put it that way. And that is to take on the problem of how do you have a successfully diverse community? And what do I mean by that? I'm not completely sure, but I think a successfully diverse community is a community in which everybody, regardless of their identities, regardless of the stereotypes out there about them, the structures out there about them, regardless of that, feel comfortable and feel like they are able to take full advantage of the opportunities in the situation, feel like they can thrive in the situation. I think it is more of a challenge perhaps than we've generally recognized, but I think it's a very interesting one. And I think we're at a phase in our society where we're moving closer and closer to that challenge emerging as a major issue. How do you do it? How actually do you make it work? Are there principles? Are there things that we know that can be applied that make this kind of a community a real possibility? So that's the general problem I want to talk about. I come to that problem from my research on stereotype threat and identity threat. It comes out of that and sort of following that line of thought and arriving at the point where this seemed to be what the major question is. How then do you make a community like this work? So that is the substance of what I will be talking about today. A lot of it, when I say community, a lot of it, the referent you can have is to, say, a university community. It could be a K-12 community. It could be a corporate community. I mean a relatively manageable, enclosed community. I don't mean it in the very generic sense. I think it's helpful to think about it in concrete terms. How do you have that community be a community where people feel comfortable and like they can thrive? I want to kind of answer a couple of questions in the talk, 3. One is why it's so important to take on this question. I think as a way of background, we're in the middle of a real demographic shift in the population of the United States. I think that's a not enough talked about source of some of the challenges that we have, that we face in our society and in our politics. And I think it raises this question of how do you achieve a successfully diverse community, makes it more relevant. So I want to talk a little bit about why that's important. And then I'm going to go out on a limb at some point and say what I think is the critical ingredient of such a community. It's worth going out on a limb, just to be clear. And I'll defend it for a while, even though, you know, I'm open. But I want to be challenging to myself and to you, so I'll take a stand on that. And then I want to talk about things that really do come from our research, and some from personal experience that are how you do it. How do you achieve this thing? How actually do you make it happen? Some ideas. So that'll be the organization of things. I'll start with a little bit of talk about stereotype threat. You know, it really began as a research problem here at the University of Michigan. Richard Nisbet and I were having a lot of lunches together talking about problems, and over a period of years following that, eventually arrived at a concept of stereotype threat. So it really did begin here at Michigan. So I'll warm us up a little bit about that concept, just to sort of anchor the talk in that story. But then I will get to this issue of what is, how do you go about having a successfully diverse community? That will be my plan. Maybe I could walk around. Could you hear me if I? Yeah, you can. So I feel freed. Okay, well, you know, as I've talked about before, the problem that I remember Dick and us having a lot of conversations about was a problem that I discovered when I first got here and was put on the Retention and Recruitment Committee for Minority Students. And on that first day, there was a graph presented which graphed out the grades that students got at the University of Michigan as a function of the SAT scores they had when they entered Michigan. And the puzzling thing was that at every level of SAT scores students had when they entered Michigan, the grade point averages for African American students were lower than the grade point averages for other students. That is known as an underperformance phenomenon. And it was a mystery, because to that moment, I think Dick too thought that if you got students you got them equally prepared as measured by an SAT, let's say, at least roughly measured by an SAT. The SAT doesn't measure all that much, but don't get me off on that topic right away. Roughly the same thing, then they should be performing the same. Why should there be a continuing gap in performance? Then within a matter of weeks, we found out that the same thing was true for women in STEM courses, especially advanced STEM courses. So there we had a phenomenon, and then we started doing what you're supposed to do, some scholarship, and found that this underperformance phenomenon, this pattern of outcomes I'm talking about, that groups whose intellectual abilities are negatively stereotyped in the broader society show this underperformance virtually everywhere in the United States. It's not just a Michigan problem by any means, it's everywhere. And it still is a very, very dominant, powerful pattern of outcomes in the United States. So we knew we had an important problem, and there, as social psychologists, there was some perhaps hubris in thinking, well, maybe we could explain this. Maybe we could come up with some account of how this happens. And sparing you a lot of meandering in the woods and some pretty ridiculous ideas, we eventually wound up with this notion of stereotype threat. And just to remind you what that is, it's anytime you're in a situation or you're doing something for which a negative stereotype about one of your identities is relevant to what you're doing. As soon as that's the situation, you know that you could be seen or treated in terms of that stereotype. And if you care about what you're doing, that's important to you, then the prospect of being reduced to a negative stereotype like that is upsetting and distraction, can interfere with your functioning right there in the immediate situation, and it can also have big consequences. It can make you feel like you don't want to be in this whole domain of life where you feel this pressure, this discomfort. It's just like, I don't want to live like that on an ongoing basis, so I might make a different decision as to what I major in, where I live in the country, who my friends are. All kinds of things could be driven by this seemingly abstract Delphic idea of a stereotype, being at risk of being seen in terms of a stereotype. Well, we sort of drafted the idea as a count of underperformance, that it was stereotype threat. That for these groups, African American students and women at the time, that it was that threat that could be causing or driving at least some part of this underperformance. I would never contend that it explains all of it, but as we drifted into our research, it seemed to explain a lot of it. And it seemed to explain a lot of it, especially under certain conditions, high pressure conditions is where this beast was the most virulent, really. That's the origin of the idea. You can see, though, that stereotype threat is a very general phenomenon. It's not something that is restricted to just this area. You can think of any identity you have, anything about yourself, your age, the region of the country you come from, your religion, your race, your gender, your sexual orientation, any of these identities, all of them, have at least some negative stereotype about them. And when you're in a situation where that negative stereotype is relevant to you, you know you could be judged or treated in terms of it. A lot of times this could be a very comical experience. You hope. I've been using the example recently of interacting with my son-in-law over how to turn on my television set. And being under the stereotype of being an older guy who's completely out of touch with technology and can't even get his television set turned on. And there is a kind of distracting stereotype threat going on there. Well, I'm monitoring what he's thinking of me as we go through these instructions. Now that turns out to be a stereotype that isn't very important, really, in the big scheme of things. I can eventually get my television set turned on, and eventually he'll forget about, his judgment of me in that moment. But so it doesn't come to a lot, but it is a legitimate form of stereotype threat, and in that sense, I think we experience stereotype threat on a daily basis in one form or another. Plucking the gray out of my eyebrows. Wait. I've done that. What would that be about? Not wanting to, that's whistling Vivaldi. That's not wanting to be seen in terms of a stereotype. Anyway, so you can see it's a very general thing. But one thing that's important to point out is, I like to point out there, is that you can use the form of stereotype threat that you feel to understand the stereotype threat that other people might feel. I think it helps you sort of get a sense, a phenomenological feeling of what this threat can be like. Otherwise, it can just sound like it's so abstract, and how could anybody really let that be a problem? I write, in writing the book, I had my father in mind, who was pretty tough about these things, and the idea that something like stereotype threat could be a meaningful challenge to you succeeding in school, or he would just consider that BS, and that you were supposed to take whatever feelings you have about being stereotyped and use that as a motive to disprove the stereotype. You weren't supposed to let something like that be a barrier to anything. Look at the background of our family, and he would go on quite a tangent, as I know you can imagine. So I don't think it's immediately obvious that the phenomenon can have the impact that we're arguing it has. But I think sometimes when you think about it in really important situations, women performing in advanced STEM courses where the elements of the situation make you feel very much like you could be seen in terms of a stereotype, that pressure can be a persistent and quite affecting feature. The research that we did really took on the question of, well, really, can it affect academic performance? Is it significant enough, forceful enough to affect academic performance? Sort of an illustrative experiment is the very first one we did here at the University of Michigan with men and women who were really good in math. Most of them were sophomores or juniors. We selected them for being really, really strong at math, having strong SAT scores, having at least 2 calculus courses, telling us that math was very important to their personal, professional goals. And we brought them into a room one at a time and gave them a very difficult math test. A half-hour section of the graduate record exam you take if you are a math major, not the general quantitative exam, but if you're a math major. And we knew this would cause frustration, taking an exam like this. We knew it would be important to them because they were so committed to doing well at math. And our reasoning is that that situation would make the experience of taking this test different for a woman than it would be for a man. For a man, they would experience the frustration of the test and maybe wonder, geez, am I as good at math as I thought I was? And did I pick the right career path? And so on and so forth. There would be these genuine anxieties there. But for a woman, there would be all of those anxieties and the additional anxiety that am I proving, or will I be seen to be proving the stereotype about women and math, not having the same math ability? So the stakes go up a bit. So that was the logic, and we found right away that indeed, even though we matched the men and the women for the preparation, the test scores and all that sort of thing, we matched them. The women scored dramatically lower in these early experiments, dramatically lower than the men who were of the same skill level. Now, that doesn't prove stereotype threat, as was pointed out to us immediately. That could prove the stereotype. It's just that the biological difference between men and women in math ability doesn't manifest itself until you give a really difficult test, and that's all you found. So we had to come up with a way of taking the stereotype threat out of that situation and seeing if that lifted women's scores. If it was stereotype threat that was suppressing their scores, and you took the stereotype threat out of the situation, then their scores should go up to match that of equally skilled men. So we did it in a simple way at the outset. We just said, look, you may have heard that women don't do as well as men on difficult standardized math tests. You might have heard that, but that's not true for the test you're taking today. The test you're taking today is a test on which women always do as well as men. So now the women are in a different psychological situation as they take the test. A dramatically different one. Their frustration cannot signal that that test is showing anything about their being a woman. It could signal that they aren't as good at math as they thought they were, and that maybe they're on the wrong career path and all those things, but that would only put them in the same situation that the men were at. This idea, they were free, just given that one introductory sentence, they were free from this pressure that they were at risk of confirming or being seen to confirm this idea about women and math ability. And with that change, their scores went up to match that of equally skilled men. The underperformance went away. So it was this research, and research like this, that was getting us to feel like stereotype threat might be a real force out there in the world. I don't think it's still decided how big a force it is, but I think it's decided that it is a force out there of some magnitude, and that probably the extent to which it is a force is a function of the elements of the situation that make that pressure intense or make that pressure less intense. I'll talk about that in a minute. We did similar experiments with race. Some people in Oklahoma did a really nifty one where they gave black and white college students an IQ test, the Ravens Progressive Matrices IQ test, and each item is a matrix with a pattern on it, and then there's 5 little matrices, and you have to pick the little matrices that has the same pattern as the big matrices, and it starts out really easy to do that, and then it gets really hard, and it starts to be frustrating. And when it's frustrating, you could worry that you're confirming or going to be seen to confirm the stereotype about intellectual ability, period, in the case of African Americans. And so, under that pressure, their performance was 15 points lower, which is about the size of the difference between African Americans and the general population in general, about a standard deviation. But the nifty thing about this experiment is that if you represented the test not as a test of intellectual abilities or an IQ test, but you represented it as just a puzzle, has no real diagnostic ability. We're just studying a puzzle today and we want you to have fun with it. Just do the best you can and have fun with it. We're looking at how it works as a puzzle. So now all of a sudden, the stereotype about your group and its intellectual ability is not relevant to what you're doing. You're just doing a puzzle. And when you're doing a puzzle, frustration is a very pleasant thing. You're doing the puzzle to be frustrated and to beat the frustration. It's a whole different frame of mindset, I guess, in modern terms. And when you do that, black scores matched white scores. The underperformance went away. So the pattern was emerging, that you get these effects, and then people try these effects, and they've been tried. There are probably, I don't know, almost 2,000 stereotype threat experiments out there in one form or another. Different stereotypes, different groups, different behaviors being measured, driving behavior in Australia, language usage behavior in France, negotiating behavior in business schools. So you just over that, in different countries, in different cultures, with different methodologies. Anyway, it became a little cottage industry. So the effect is, I think, a reliable effect at this point. I think we do, in the follow-on years, know more about how it's mediated, and I think the analogy to keep in mind there is that it's something like multitasking, that you're doing 2 things at the same time. You are doing the task at hand, and you're also trying to beat that damn stereotype, just like my father would encourage you to do. When you see underperformance, it's usually not happening because a person is giving up in that situation. It's just defeated. It's happening because the person is trying too hard. But now you're trying to do 2 things. You're trying to do the task, and then you're trying to monitor how well you're doing the task and whether the way you're doing the task is actually enough to defeat the stereotype. And that takes up a lot of cognitive resources to do all that monitoring and checking in and back and forth. And so you're not going to perform as well as we know definitively from the multitasking research. You're not just absorbed in the task. I think this comes from the fact that stereotype threat puts you in a fundamentally vigilant mode. I've been using for a while now the image of, because I remember this happened to me, coming home and being told there's a snake in the house. And yeah, Dad, there is a snake in the house. I saw the snake crawl in the house. And what mode do you go in at that time? You're boom, there's a preoccupation that takes over. What was that sound? What does that mean? We never did find the snake in the house. I'd say we just lived through that, but it was not pleasant. Anyway, that's a little bit what it's like, that you don't know whether you're going to be judged or treated that way or not. It's not like you know you're going to be treated that way and therefore you react. It's that you're in a situation where it's just fundamentally ambiguous. And yet, it's important to you. If it's not important to you, this is a big, important part of understanding the phenomenon. One way of protecting yourself against any form of stereotype threat is not to care about the behavior that is at issue. If it's women in math, just disidentify with math. Go major in something else where you don't feel that pressure. Then it becomes less of a personal problem. You may feel some empathy for your sisters who are committed to succeeding in a STEM field, that they have to deal with this discomfort, and you wonder how they do it and so on. But it's not your problem. So one way you can reliably get rid of, if you're an African-American kid in the 6th grade and you want to get rid of this pressure, you can just think it's not that important. School's just not that important. I'm going to be a basketball player. I'm mimicking my grandkids at this point. I want to be a basketball player. That just seems so much cooler to them. Anyway, that's a digression. But it kind of illustrates the point. What makes you susceptible to stereotype threat is caring a lot about the behavior that is stereotyped, caring a lot about succeeding in the domain where your group is negatively stereotyped. I used to sometimes use the opening minutes of the movie 8 Mile to illustrate this. There's Eminem, the white rapper, who has to come out on stage in this completely black audience and go head to head with these black rappers to the audience chanting, "You're white with a mic. You're lame. You can't do this." That's the stereotype. They're chanting the stereotype at him. And the movie starts out, those of you who have seen it, probably in this area, many people have seen it. He can't go on. He starts, he gets the beat, but he has to just turn over the mic to the DJ because he can't kind of enter in the competition. And the rest of the movie is sort of a story about how he kind of navigates through the stereotype threat that he feels as a white guy trying to do this black thing under the stereotype that white guys don't do that thing very well. That's what makes you susceptible to this threat, is feeling this a commitment to doing well in the domain where your group is negatively stereotyped, traditionally not that represented. It's also a condition of life that's worth pointing out. It's not something that you can just disprove once and for all and it's over. You can just prove that stereotype and it's over. It's a condition of life because the threat is not something in your head. It's not a belief about yourself or even a belief about your group. It's not that. It's that other people could see you in terms of that stereotype. It's an intersubjective reading of what other people could think about you in a situation. And we all know the stereotypes in this society. So when we're in a situation where they're relevant, we know damn well that people could see us that way. And if it's important to us, then this tension starts to enter the situation. It comes from this intersubjective perception. So this has been a very important thing for a social psychologist to try to struggle with getting people to absorb this feature of it. It's not necessarily a belief about oneself or a belief about one's group. It's this, I don't know if I'm being seen this way, but I'm sure as hell in a situation where I could be seen this way. It's like the snake is in the house. And I don't know if that's what that sound was. What did he mean when he said that? Why didn't she return my email? You're in a situation where you're reading tea leaves to assess, are you subject to this kind of judgment and this kind of treatment in this situation, or are you not? And you don't really know. You're looking, when you get a good sign, you're kind of happy. When you get a bad sign, here comes the threat again. So you can imagine this framework as a way of understanding the experience we're all having on our campuses, especially this year. These are general experiences, but probably since Trump's election, they've become very more frequent. It worries you when you see signs, hate speech, events of this sort that signal how you might be seen here. How broad is this view of my group? How broad is it out there? How much am I going to have to contend with in this situation? Is it just going to pass? I should point this out, I think one of the most intense forms of stereotype threat that we've studied in our lab is the stereotype threat that whites can feel in interracial conversations or interactions where the topic turns to race. I just saw a slur report, which was some study that somehow measured, I didn't press the methodology here, but somehow measured what groups what groups found the most offensive way of thinking about them. What slur were they most upset about when they were in this society would they be upset about? And for white Americans right now, the top thing that people do not want to be seen in terms of is racist. That is just really not something people want to be seen in terms of. So, simple experiment. We bring white guys into the laboratory. They're going to have a conversation. They're going to talk to two other students. In one condition, the two other students are white. In another condition, the two other students are black. They're going to talk about either love and relationships, something that's pretty easy for people to talk to each other about, or they're going to talk about racial profiling, something that's harder, obviously harder to have a conversation between groups about. Then the experimenter says, well, I'm going to go down the hall and get your two conversation partners, bring them back for the conversation. While I'm gone, I would like you to arrange the 3 chairs here in the room for the conversation. And you can imagine what happens. When they're expecting to talk to 2 white guys about anything, they put the 3 chairs close together. But when they're thinking of talking to 2 black guys about love and relationships, they put the 3 chairs close together. But when they're going to talk to 2 black guys, 2 strangers, about racial profiling, they put a real distance between themselves and the 2 conversation partners. The distance starts to grow. And we've measured how prejudiced they are before the experiment through the various means we social psychologists do that. We've measured that. And the tendency to press away, put distance between themselves and the conversation partners is greatest for the least prejudiced participants. The women who show the biggest effects of stereotype threat on math performance are the women who are the most committed, the best, strongest students. Remember, it's being invested in the domain where your group is negatively stereotyped that makes you feel the pressure of the stereotype. That's what makes the pressure meaningful to you. So if you're invested in the domain of good relationships, there's a lot of risk to be talking to 2 black guys about racial profiling where you could just make a little innocent mistake and bring down the judgment of being a racist. So you want to avoid that situation. You want to define the situation in a way that this is not relevant. Race is not the thing we need to talk about. So we have here our history as Americans, visiting us in our daily lives and affecting patterns of behavior in our daily lives. It's not like the history is just a kind of abstract cognitive thing. It creates predicaments that we live with on an ongoing basis every day and that have a profound effect on the pattern of our relationships with each other. And at least one of the ways by which that history is mediated is through this a phenomenon like stereotype threat. It makes the stakes so high for certain kinds of interactions that it becomes hard to have those interactions. If we went to another society where the stereotypes are different history, you might find it really easy to have a conversation about something like that. But in this society, with our history, what makes the stereotype threat an intense, stronger or weaker pressure? I think our big lesson there over the years in this literature is that it's the cues, it's the features of the situation that affect how much the likelihood, your perception of the likelihood of being stereotyped. Cues in this. I talk about in the book Sandra Day O'Connor's experience being the only woman on the Supreme Court. She says the experience is asphyxiating. Being the only woman, she was carrying the whole burden of her group. Is she smart enough? Is she wise enough? Is she a feminist? Is she too much of a feminist? And all of this pressure on her. Ruth Bader Ginsburg gets there. The situation changes a little bit. The situation changes. Nothing inside Sandra Day O'Connor changes. It's the situation that changes. All of a sudden, she has critical mass in the situation. There's another woman. She begins to understand that people aren't seeing her in the same way they used to see her, as carrying the soul burden all by herself. It starts to be a much more tolerable experience to be on the Supreme Court. So what the features of a situation, I have just become more and more impressed with this, almost to the point of thinking that it's the features of the way our society is organized around identity, the way in which our society is organized around identity, that brings most of the identity threat that we have in life. It isn't so much, I'm going to way overstate something here just to be clear, and so know that I don't believe it, what I'm about to say, but I'm going to state it just to be just dramatically clear. I think it's less a problem of bias and that it's more a problem of the way our society has been organized around these identities that produces a sense of threat. And I even think that it's the way the society is organized around these identities that produces the particular biases that we have, that attitudes and beliefs follow behaviors and follow the way our society is organized rather than solely drive them. Okay, that's an overstatement, but you get where I'm going with this. I remember we did an intervention in a dorm here years ago. And something amazing happened, which was, we had selected kids randomly from the incoming class at Michigan, and we invited them into a program that was going to be about diversity, about living in a diverse community, and we were going to help them navigate the complexities of the University of Michigan and so on. So we had a lot of people volunteered to do it. They were in roughly the same ethnic proportions as the general Michigan population. So we were off, and we started the year with some beautiful lectures about diversity and how it had always been a Central American resource. Diversity had been what made America great, and people, they all resonated to that. They'd volunteered to be part of it. And then about 3 weeks later, I came into the dorm about dinner time, and almost all of the white kids were gone, and there were only black kids in the cafeteria. And then a couple of weeks later, the reverse happened. There were like hardly any black kids in the cafeteria, it was mainly white kids in the cafeteria. Well, they were off rushing their fraternities and sororities. And that's what accounted for that pattern of behavior. So everything we said about diversity, they kind of liked it in the abstract, even in the personal level. But down on the ground, they knew from that this society is still fundamentally organized around that identity. And that you better pay attention to that identity because it's real. The society is organized that way. And I start the book by talking about coming home from school in the third grade, segregated Chicago, all black kids were walking home. Somebody says, I'm going to go swimming in that pool every day that's 3 blocks over in the white neighborhood. And somebody else says, no, we can only go swimming in that pool on Wednesday afternoons, man, Wednesday afternoons. And I'll just never forget the puzzlement that we had. Like, who is we and who is they? What does this mean? Why would this be? You never quite get an answer to any of those questions, but you all of a sudden know that something about you is very important that this little color, this thing is going to be really important and that you're going to have to deal with it in some way. So I don't want us to, I think focusing a lot on bias, which I'm very proud my field is probably the most central field in revealing to us the nature of bias and so on. But I don't want us to forget the fact that down on the ground we still have profound organizations, profound segregations going on so that are organized around identity. Identity has from the very outset of this country been a mechanism by which advantage and disadvantage has been allocated. The identity of whiteness, brought together a dominant European a class of people who then immediately developed a class of people called Indians who were, to that point, very different tribes, very different cultures, never saw themselves having all of this in common before. But these identities were created and evolved as a way of allocating advantage and disadvantage, and we still have a great deal of that legacy in our society, and that is a great deal of where the source of identity threat comes from. So when I arrive on a campus as a kid, can I really assume that that identity isn't going to matter? That it won't be something that could affect me at some point? That maybe I should be cautious here? So you get the sort. Even if everybody, if you could make a magic wave a wand and you could wipe all of the bias out of that situation, given the history we have as a society, and given the ongoing organizations we have as a society, where does the school funding go? Where are the good schools? Where are the bad schools? Who goes to prison? I mean, who's got the health problems? You could just go right down the line as to how identity seems to shape all those things, and it would just be an extraordinary feat to ignore that. Anyway, I don't want to be too depressing here. I just want to make a point that this is the source of the sense of identity threat that I'm talking about. There are other features. I think some of our ideologies that have evolved are particularly tough. Our ideologies about ability, which stereotype threat research runs right into. The idea that ability, especially intellectual ability, is something that's substantially genetic, substantially fixed, substantially limiting, and maybe differentially distributed among identities. That's an ideology that has been a part of American life. It has driven a lot of the very science that I am a part of. It's the dark side of psychology, I'll say. That ideology. So now when I come into a situation like this and I begin to have some frustration, and that ideology about ability is there, it makes it really pretty definitive that maybe I just don't belong here, or maybe I'm going to be seen as not belonging here. So the combination of the organization, I'm being an amateur sociologist here, trying to pull out the structure of where in our daily lives a sense of this threat can come from. Okay, so I'm going to propose my solution to this. I think that we have to recognize the persistence of this. It isn't something, this sense of threat, this sense of discomfort, it isn't something that's temporary. It's a feature of trying to bring together a diverse community. I think a lot of our assumptions about pedagogy, from how you organize K through 12, how the role of curriculum, how you mentor students, the role that accountabilities have, the assumptions about measuring ability, a lot of this comes from an era when who we were educating was a pretty homogeneous and very selected group. Pretty homogeneous and selected group, largely white males of a certain class. But the feature of that world I want to point to is that there was an identity homogeneity. Everybody had the same identity. So you probably couldn't see any connection between social identity and intellectual development, growing, education. There couldn't, because everybody had the same identity. But when you have a very diverse a population like the one I just described, where people are coming from these very different histories, and you try to put them together in a school, on a campus, you can see that the same assumptions about how you educate people, the very nature of education, might not transfer that well. Some might, but some might not. And that's, I think, the situation we're moving into as a society, as this society gets increasingly more diverse. That's part of what the challenge is. So I want to make the point, I suppose, that at the heart of it all is a matter of trust. That trust is the thing that this kind of diversity makes a very precious commodity. that it's very hard to just trust across these lines, to be comfortable. We can often do it in one-on-one relationships, friendships. We can get that sense of comfort and trust. But when you try to do it to scale, as they say, at the institutional level, it's harder to do that. And that's where I think we don't know so much about how to do it. I guess I want to say that's where that's where I think the focus of the science, the relevant sciences, should be. How do you do that at a scale? How do you have a classroom, a diverse classroom, remember, function in a way where everybody can feel a sense of trust? And how important is it to build trust? So again, in my overstatement mode, I might say, I think it's much more important for institutions to focus on building that trust than to focus entirely, at any rate, on bias. I think all that's very important because I think it does give us the knowledge and the acumen that we need in order to deal with a genuinely diverse society in the ways I've just been talking about. There needs to be an understanding of our history and an understanding of how that affects our lives. That needs to be there. But what has to happen also is a kind of ongoing effort to build trust in our communities. And how do you do that when you have a very diverse community? It might be relatively easy to do if you had a homogeneous community, but it might be much more difficult to do when you have a real diverse community. So, ways of doing it. I'm just going to go down a list of things, and then I hope I'll get through that list pretty quickly, and maybe there'll be some time for some questions here. And then I'm going to end with a sort of newer notion about this that I want to try out on you. One thing I think on the list is looking at the way our institutions are organized. How is our social life organized? Who takes what courses? Who takes what majors? Major, we think of majors, choosing a major as a decision that comes from, there's the famous Steve Jobs lecture. It comes from your really inborn love of something, that you're supposed to find the real you in there and let that direct your choice of major. A lot of it is done in terms of social identity negotiations, where I'm going to feel comfortable and where I'm not going to feel comfortable. There's a huge role in that. So looking at how our world is organized that way and focusing on that, how is our history represented? That's become certainly the issue of the moment, or maybe the issue of the summer. I know it seems to have waned a little bit, but how do we represent our history? How do we feel about each other? These are things I think we should look at the nuts and bolts, the structure of our institutions and the way they're organized, and be proactive about thinking about them. Let's be active. Should we change the name of that school, or should we not change the name of that school? What is that going to mean? Sometimes you could see it going either way. These aren't things, I think, where there's a complete sweeping answer in one direction or another. I just think there needs to be a proactive effort to look at these things. Mindset, I think, is another big deal. In that experiment where the white guys were having a conversation with the two black guys about racial profiling, there was a solution that got them to put their chairs together, which I think is very useful at the level of us as individuals. And that is, we told them just before we went off to get the two conversation partners, we said, look, these are difficult conversations, especially in the United States. Nobody really knows how to have these kind of conversations. They're difficult. They can make anybody feel uncomfortable. And the tact to take here is just to take it as a learning experience. Don't take it as a situation where you have to go into this conversation and perform not being a racist. That's a hard performance to sustain over any period of time. But if you take a different mindset, if you take it as an opportunity to learn from somebody something, and when you're in doubt, just fall back on asking questions. So as soon as we gave them that instruction, they moved their chairs really close together and wanted to have a really intense conversation. So I think mindset is amazing. One general thing I think is that, that people trust people who are interested in them and want to help them. You can detect that. And that is a hugely effective way of bridging over these divides that I'm talking about, just being interested. I could tell 100 stories about, you know, Gil Evans and Miles Davis, white guy, kind of a unsophisticated guy, and Miles Davis, a very sophisticated and kind of bitter guy, and yet the greatest friendship in each of their lives. So how does that happen? Well, they're interested in each other. And interest and connection like that is very, very powerful. And it doesn't have to be anything performative. It has to be a genuine exercise of curiosity and interest. So mindset, I think, is something. Then I think also, you know, in a homogeneous environment, you might not have to worry about being nice. You could just be mean to your students, or you could be demanding in ways that would just be fine in a situation where everybody trusts each other and they know how to read that situation. But in a diverse situation, be nice. Be tactful. It goes a long way. And I think we need to retrieve just that as a strategy going forward. In that intervention that we did here at Michigan, an interesting finding emerged, which is we had a lot of academic support, but we also had, on Thursday nights, a chance for people to have an interracial conversation with each other about personal life. We structured it so we gave them a little topic to talk about each week. Their parents, their finances, leaving boyfriends and girlfriends back home, and these kind of things. They got to know each other over a 6 months period of time. We didn't talk about anything identity related or politically related. They got to actually, so it was an amazing experience for all of the participants. Had a huge effect on African American students' grades, a very significant effect on their grades and on their roommate choices and on the way they designed their experience through the university. It gave them a very different information basis on which to interpret the experience that they were having here. That when most people, because of our history, the way ethnicity organizes things, when you come on a campus like this and you talk to people about personal things, for the most part you're talking to in-group people. And if you're an African American having that conversation, you're talking to other black people about what's going on. And you may not have the information that a lot of what's happening to you is also happening to non-black students. And that you don't have to overread the degree to which that identity is a significant thing in a situation. But if you don't have an opportunity to have personal conversations across group lines like that, you wouldn't have the informational basis. It would seem ridiculous. There's a wonderful interview of Ta-Nehisi Coates interviewing Obama that was in, I think it's in his new book. I'm pushing his new book, but it was in the Atlantic last year. And you get this conversation, it's almost like King and Malcolm X. Obama can trust. He says, you can trust. What you gave the white electorate was that you trusted them. You granted them some innocence. And I can't do that. You were raised in Hawaii by white people. I was raised in a hyper ghetto in Baltimore by two Black Panther parents. And it's really hard for me to have that kind of trust. It's just hard. Don't think I could pull it off. Well, there's a mountain in that to unpack. But the experience of segregation, being in one's own enclave all the time, or it gives you a different information basis with which to live your life. Obama versus Coates. You get a very good image of that. So I think one thing, it's almost a responsibility of institutions of higher education, is to give more of us the opportunity to have these kind of cross-group conversations about personal things. Then we will all get different information about what the experience of other groups are, and I think this is necessary to have a successfully diverse community. I think it's not easy to just come from very segregated situations and willfully get along together. I think there has to be understandings and relationships developed and connections and exchanges of information that make that a relatively easy and natural thing. And I think as institutions, that's one thing we could do a better job of finding. What are the venues? What are the ways in which we get people to talk to each other and know who each other are? Narratives about the situation we're in. There's a lot of the intervention research coming out of stereotype threat research, which almost directly manipulates or injects a narrative about the situation you're in. I think of it as the minority parent issue. How do you raise your child? What narrative do you give them about being in the United States? Do you say that it is we have been oppressed from the very beginning and there's no seeming let up? That's one thing. Or no, that's all gone, we're in a post-racial world. That's on the other pole. So how do you manage that space with your children? If you are going to give them the darkest possible account of everything, there may be some accuracy in it, but it's going to defeat them. They need some hope. They need some sense that they can live a full life in this society and be part of things. So that's probably, but false consciousness on the other hand, that's not. So I think as institutions with our students, we should tend directly to this narrative. It should be realistic, but it should be hopeful. That's, again, a part of the Obama recipe. It was realistic, but it was hopeful. And it galvanized an electorate that has never been galvanized before. So I think there is in our society an appetite for an understanding that brings us together. And I think that's evidence of that. So the narrative. The last thing I want to stress, there's all kinds of things that I think people call window dressing that I think are important. I think representativeness, I think critical mass is hugely important. I think symbols, pictures on the walls, all these things are things that we can use to be inclusive, signals of inclusiveness that give us some sign that we're comfortable in a diverse community. One thing also I'll say is I think of my own experience in graduate school, feeling greatly, I've talked about this, feeling greatly under a lot of pressure, pretty much shut down by that pressure for the first year and a half for sure. And then I noticed that my advisor was taking me very seriously. Or maybe he was taking the research we were doing really seriously because maybe he had to get tenure. I don't know what it was, but I couldn't get rid of the guy. He wanted to talk about it. He wanted me to get those analyses done. He wanted me to write up paragraphs. He was like I could see that there was something serious going on. And then I began to see what the pathway was to being a scientist. Well, you get a problem, then you get some hypotheses, then you do some experiments, and then you write that up, and maybe you'd get it published. And if you did that, maybe you could be a professor. So he gave me a path forward, and he helped me move along that path. He didn't know was he biased? Of course, we're all biased, so yes. Did he know anything about my background? Very little did he know, but we had a focus where he took me seriously, and I trusted him. I trusted him because he was helping me. He was moving me along. There's a beautiful memoir by Kareem Abdul-Jabbar about his coach, John Wooden, which I recommend to all of you. And here you got this 7'2" hip kid from Harlem being coached by a Midwestern, basic, fundamentalist, Christian, rigid coach. When Wooden dies, who's on his deathbed, Jabbar says, "You're my father." They were incredibly close for 50, 60 years. How does that happen? All the things I'm talking about, different histories, the meaning of identity, how does that happen? Well, Kareem says, you know, I played on the freshman team, I practiced with the freshman team, and then one day he took me and had me practice with the varsity team. And it was like moving from driving a VW to driving a Maserati. And he was going to show me how to get there. He showed me how to put my socks on. He showed, you know, so he helped him. One of the last speeches Wooden made a year before, or less than a year before he died, was to his assembled throngs of admirers and former players. And he's pretty old, he's not going to give a full speech. And he says, well, the one thing that I regret most in my life is that I couldn't help you more. I couldn't help you more. Well, that conveys I think the heart of where trust comes from. If somebody's going to help me get there, I'm going to resonate to that. And I think it's a resource for us. That's what these institutions, what we're supposed to be doing in these institutions, is helping people get to where they want to go, helping the society in that way. And we may forget that on a daily basis. That's a very powerful way of engendering the sort of trust we have, and I think helping to create the kind of communities we're talking about. Well, I could go on in this vein, but probably it's time to stop. and I don't know, I hope we have some time for questions at this point. Thank you.
Hello. Hi, thank you so much for your talk. My name is Devin Keene. I'm with the School of Information, and here I am.
Oh,
Hi.
nice.
I was really struck by your comments about the structural nature of the challenges that bring to pulling together a diverse community, and that much of it is around the way society is organized, and the attitudes and beliefs often follow that. Your subsequent comments really focused on how do we just deal with the society as it is, structured as it is, and how do we then support people, really in institutions like this. We're talking about students of color, first-generation students, in some cases veterans. How do we help them integrate into society where they are othered and often face a stereotype threat? I'd love to hear some thoughts about how we start changing the way the smaller community society of our university, which we have obviously more control over than we do society at large or community at large. What are some first steps that we might take to dismantle some of these organizations? Or is there something we can do, or a place we can start to start looking at ourselves and the structures themselves and do both at the same time?
Mm-hmm. I'm teaching a freshman seminar this quarter, and we had a big discussion. They want to talk an awful lot about the choice of majors, and they want to talk about roommate assignments. Since we're talking about structural things within an institution, how are the roommate assignments made here? Do you get to pick your roommate, or are you assigned a roommate? If you get to pick your roommate, you're probably going to encourage you're going to allow the standard organizations out there to come in here. If you're going to assign roommates, you get to engineer a little bit. Relationships. You collect a lot of information. You try to get people with interest compatibilities, but you might, again, this is something. This is what it might look like. It just comes to mind as an example of an answer to your question, where you try to create dorm communities, living learning communities, where people get an inherent opportunity to talk to each other, to know each other. You also, I don't want for a minute to take away from the importance of in-group experiences, that you need that grounding and that repose sometimes, because we do have this society that's organized that way. So you need that. But you also need a counter-organizing that allows people to talk to each other. I think also with regard to choice of majors that we need to most people do that it's a pretty laissez-faire kind of decision. You're reading the kid who's down the hall. That person has as much to say to you as anybody else. So we're letting that be decided by, I think, these outside organizations that come in. It's another place where I think we could organize interactions between students in a more formal, more structured way that would begin to expose them more to a whole variety of possibilities that might have different impact, that might direct their lives along different pathways. You can think of universities as one of the biggest opportunity structures they're ever going to be in. It's a huge, wonderful period of life but the anxiety can be such that we just kind of try to find a channel and move along that. When we get to be 30 years old, we often think, well, geez, I wish I could go to university now, because now I'd know what to make of it. Well, I know these two things I'm suggesting are pretty engineering kind of things, and we know the reaction to that, but I think they're feasible it's come to mind as feasible and illustrative ways of structuring different kinds of relationships and undoing some of the ethnic and identity-based organization of campus. Now, there's a whole tirade out there about identity politics and how horrible it is and how it lost the election and so on and so forth. Well, this country's founded in identity politics. We don't want to forget that. Identities were used to structure advantage in this society, and identity politics at their best are trying to undo some of the structures that the old identity politics produced. Now, as a provost at 2 universities, I have been the target of plenty of excesses of identity politics. There is no doubt about that. So I know it has a downside to it. We have to, I think some of the things I just mentioned might help ameliorate those kinds of excesses. But acknowledging those excesses, we're not going to get rid of identity politics in that sense. We have to make it a more informed, more civil part of our lives. And these kind of reorganizations that give people broader social exposure, the social organization, and the role that identity plays in social organizations is one place I would really look to. Who gets invited to watch what football, try to really think of ways to intervene there.
Can you say something about the flip side of stereotype threat, perhaps a stereotype boost based on positive stereotypes? And the second part of the question is how fixed or immutable are stereotypes?
Yeah, there is a phenomenon called stereotype lift, where if you're on the upside of another group's negative stereotype, you tend to benefit from that. And I think the way you benefit from that is that frustration doesn't mean the same thing to you. I remember doing a math experiment in a junior high school in Palo Alto, and we gave a really hard test to the boys and the girls. And the girls, when they took the test and it was really frustrating, they said, "Geez, maybe I'm not so good at math." When the boys took the test and it was very frustrating, a lot of them said, "Well, it wasn't my fault. I don't have a really good teacher this year. We never covered that stuff." And it's kind of so here's the stereotype structure affecting how I'm interpreting my experiences here in that situation. And the stereotype about women in math is actually maybe buoying up the resilience to frustration that the boys feel in that situation. As an African-American male, I've often used the example of me being a pretty bad basketball player, but not feeling like my ineptitude meant that I shouldn't be there. because this is what we do. And I was raised in a where we played basketball all the time. So the fact that I'm not that good at it doesn't mean I should leave the domain. This is our, well, it takes a lot more frustration to get me out of the domain that way than it would for some member of a group who's not well stereotyped, not positively stereotyped in that domain. So I think stereotypes in general enter into our reasoning about ourselves in these ways, and sometimes they boost us and sometimes they don't. I think stereotypes do change, and they've changed in my lifetime. Racial stereotypes have changed dramatically. When I was a kid, it was, black men were portrayed as fearful and bug-eyed and scared of their own shadow. I don't know if you remember that, Step and Fetch It, and that whole kind of movie representation. That's not the stereotype anymore. It's almost on the other end of the continuum, where they're seen as dangerous and resentful and, in a very different light. So stereotypes change. Stereotypes, I think, are just plain rationalizations for things that we see in life. I heard a perfect example the other day on NPR. It was a historian talking about slavery, and he was talking about two auctioneers, slave auctioneers, auctioning off the members of a family, slave family, to different plantations. And he turns to his partner and says, they don't care about family. So here's an idea, a creation that justifies something that they're doing. He has no evidence for that. Doesn't come out, there's no grain of truth in that. It's just, it helps explain the inequality. So I would expect that as these organizations around identity begin to soften and fade, that the stereotypes would begin to soften and fade. I'm a big believer that bias and prejudice grows out of the organization of society. That's what's producing it in big part. Why do the black people live over there and not over here where we live? As soon as you notice that, you have to come up with some story that accounts for that. And that's the birth of stereotypes. And as that softens, you don't need that stereotype to the same degree. And so I think that's an important reality about them.
Thank you for that talk. That was really interesting. I'm a physicist, and I still come across a lot of pushback from some colleagues that have said to me that they think the underrepresentation of women in STEM is due to biological differences. And I really enjoyed your book, and I often quote the example in the book and what you gave today about the test with women in math. But then they claim that that is further evidence for their point, saying that, well, women are easily distracted or perhaps not tough enough to be in STEM. And I'm wondering what you would say to them about that, or what I could say to them about that.
Yeah, the first thing that comes to mind is I'd find some form of stereotype threat that they experience and describe that, and then say, well, that's what women feel in these situations. Give them something emotional subjectively emotional to hang on to, so they have a referent for what you're describing from them. Describing your own stereotype threat to a disinterested outgroup member, I personally found that to be ineffective, just like you have. It's like, how could that be? I don't really see that. So they do need an analogy to begin to grasp the situation. They'll also push back on all of the data, and they don't believe this. And, there are going to be a lot of defenses out there, and stereotype threat has certainly gone against a number of belief communities that believe intelligence really is biological and limiting. They don't like it. The testing, people who invested in standardized testing as part of their own self-concept and their own sense of fairness, and they don't like that you could move test performance around like that. So I wish I had a definitive story to tell, because data will help, but it won't carry the day by itself. Has been my experience. But So maybe it's developing relationships in another way. You know, I thought Rob, just before we were coming here today, gave a great account of how if you build out a relationships, the kind of relationships that maybe they're not focused on identity and so on, but they just build when you've got that relationship more developed, then this conversation is less likely to encounter this sort of defensiveness. And people are more open to it. They might be open to it, for example, if their daughter told them that, or if their wife told them that. They begin to, whoa, really? You don't have an agenda here. You could just be. So I recommend that maybe as the best I can come up with as a strategy. Hang in there.
Please join me in thanking Claude for this wonderful talk and for being here today.
Thank you. Thank you, my man.